us with where do we go from here. And there's some pretty good solutions that are already in place that we just have to implement. And some of these we will implement on a local group level. And so if you are not already active in a local group and you would like to become active with the FireWise program, getting a hold of your local leader is the best way to start. And we have a handout in the back that shows contact information for the leaders for each of the subgroups. So if you want to get active when this is over, when the meeting is over, that's a good way to do it. Alex will probably have other ways to do it. So Alex Ramler is the Fire Planning Coordinator, Western Lane District, Oregon Department of Forestry. And Lauren Grant is the Extension Forester, Maine County, Oregon State University, Forestry and Natural Resources Extension. She thanked me for all that. So thank you, and thank you to Carrie and Lee for hosting this event.
Thank you, Carrie and Lee.
So, Alex Rommel with Oregon Department of Forestry. I'm on the Western Lane, or the district offices in Bonita. Questions for me, if you have any after this, you want to get a hold of me, are really going to have to do with fire prevention, how to create defensible space, FireWise communities, how you can get involved. Basically, everything to do with wildfire prevention will be good questions to come in with. All right.
My name is Lauren Grant. I work for Oregon State University. We do the community education off campus. So I focus in the Forestry and Natural Resources program. And so we have an office here in Eugene. And if you have any questions about forest management, fire ecology, wildlife habitat, things like that that have to do with the forestry aspect of your property, I'm happy for you to come talk to me about those things. So I'm here to support Alex, and I'm excited for you all to be learning some great stuff.
Thank you, Lauren. Thank you, Sarah, for putting this all together. Okay. All right, so today's talk is basically, it's going to be about three things. One is a little background history on fire ecology and the current state of fire trends in the U.S. We're going to talk about what you can do on your individual property to make your home more defensible in the event of a wildfire. We're going to talk about what you can do as a community. So around your house is the first step, and then a broader community context, which we'll use with some case studies from the Camp Fire in California. So those are the kind of three things that we're going to be hitting on: home defensible space, a little bit about fire ecology, and what we've learned from the Camp Fire down in California. So with that, wildfires in Lane County. So a brief background on forest fires. If you're in Lane County, depending on the ecotype, so if it's like an oak savanna or a Doug fir forest, you have different fire return intervals. And fire return intervals are basically how often does a fire move through the landscape naturally, right? And so with oak forests in the Willamette Valley, typically that was 7 to 15 years. So every 7 to 15 years, a fire would move through the same area. That's for oak forest. For Doug fir forest, depending on where you were in elevation, it was as short as maybe 40 to 50 years, up to 100, 150, 300 years plus on the coast. Okay. So what happens when fires move through an area more frequently is it consumes more fuel. So typically the more fire an area sees, the less accumulation of fuel there will be. Because if a fire comes through in every 7 years it's burning some of that fuel. It reduces the amount of fuel that accumulates. So that's what we see on the left here. Typically these are low intensity, low severity fires. So they move relatively quickly, they don't kill trees, but they reduce the amount of fuel loading vegetation that's on the ground. The more infrequent a fire becomes, the more growth you have, and the more fuel loading in the forest you will have. So when you have more fuel, the opportunity for a crown replacing fire, which is when the tops of the trees burn and actually kills mature trees, is higher. Right? So the more fuel you have on the ground, the more likely it is that you're going to lose live, large trees. So this would be an example of crown, and then there's this whole spectrum in between where you can have group torching in areas that have heavy pockets of fuel, and so on. So what drives a lot of this is weather. It's also fuel type, and fuel type is really the one thing that we can manipulate, right? We have less control over the weather, but we can control how the fuel is arranged and what type of fuel is out there. So fuel like fine fuel, like grass, dries out really quickly, burns really quickly, doesn't have a lot of residual heat, and doesn't send up a lot of embers, right? As we start moving from fine to coarse, fire intensity becomes hotter, it lasts longer, and it has the ability to dry out things that would normally not burn from a low severity fire. We also look at the arrangement of fuel. So this is heavily arranged both horizontally and vertically, right? So the more horizontal continuity you have, the easier it is for fire to move from fuel to fuel, and that it impacts the way that fire spreads. So if it's discontinuous, right here we may have a surface fire because we have continuous fine fuel on the ground, but we don't see much vertical continuity of fuel. There's fuel up in the treetops, there's fuel on the ground, there's nothing in between. So by manipulating how that fuel is arranged, we can actually impact how a fire behaves when it passes through an area.
Can I ask a question right there?
Absolutely.
What about the effect of wind on the drying and the heating in terms of like clearing the ladders?
It's a good question.
It can come, if it's coming later, I don't care, that can come later.
Yeah, so if you open up a stand too much, and that's probably maybe a question for Warren, but if you open up a stand too much, you can have that effect. But if you have enough separation, then all that really means is you're going to have a more intense surface fire. But if you have enough distance from the surface to the canopy, you're still going to prevent a crown fire.
Can we stop for 1 second? Can you guys see?
There's some room on the couch here.
Sneaking off your
Yeah.
computer. Come on.
Anybody over here?
There's a chair over here. There's room for a chair here.
And do we want to drop the shades on those windows there?
There's a chair over here.
There's room on the sofa.
There's a front and center seat for you.
Yeah, you can.
All right, so then the final thing to talk about with fuel is, how it grows, right? So typically fine fuel grows relatively quickly, and we'll sometimes have it die off in one season, right? So that's actually what we saw last year in California, was they had a really wet winter. Well, I guess 2 seasons ago. They had a wet winter, which actually meant that they had a lot of fine fuel growth, right? So they actually had a wet winter is sometimes not the best thing, especially when we start looking at fine fuel. The more coarse it becomes, the longer it takes for that fuel to accumulate. So by taking out some large coarse fuel, it can be a really good bang for the buck in terms of reducing the intensity of that fire in certain areas. All right. So, yeah.
How much did the ice storm we had, 2-3 years ago, have on the accumulation of coarse fuels in our area?
It's an
Could you
excellent
repeat the
question.
question?
So his question was, we had an ice storm a couple years ago, and what was that impact on coarse woody debris, large diameter, fuel on the ground? The answer is it had a lot. So what we call those areas, so if you have a tree that falls down, and it creates, let's say a large oak tree falls down. In that area, it takes down a couple smaller trees that are next to it. What we call those areas when a fire is going through, we call that a jackpot. Because the fire will be creeping around until it gets to this jackpot of fuel and it blows up. And a lot of people that I've talked to, and this is what we do with our helping people create defensible space, a lot of people I've talked to have not caught up with that ice storm. They're 2-3 years behind the management that they want to be. Yeah.
Well, the city had refused to clean up in the Spencer View area, and that looks like that bomb hit right along Fox Hollow Rock, the Raptor Center.
Yeah.
I mean, all these little trees that are just, one cigarette.
Interesting thing about, so you bring up the city actually spent their entire annual urban forestry budget by the end of February. Cleaning up and just removing trees that were blocking roads, down power lines. They got disaster relief funding, and that's why they were able to continue. But they burned through their entire yearly budget in 2 months just dealing with street trees and high, just getting through an area. So, all right. So when we start accumulating fuel, and if we take fire out of an environment, so say we have an oak savanna that typically burns every 7 to 10 years. Now let's say we take fire out of that and it doesn't burn for 50 years. What we get is an accumulation of fuel, especially in the understory. It starts on the ground and it starts growing up. The more accumulation of fuel on the ground that you have underneath large trees, we call these ladder fuels. And basically it's a ladder for fire to start on the ground and then it starts going up in a canopy. If we have flame lengths over 11 feet, from a wildland firefighting perspective, we're not doing a direct attack, which means we're not digging lines close to the fire. We don't have bulldozers in there creating contingency lines. We're moving back from the fire and we're trying to catch it at a different spot. Even air attack on 11-foot flame lengths really, it happens, but it doesn't really slow it.
I went through the Yellowstone fire the next year, and I followed it when it was happening. And quite honestly, people think it was burned to a crisp, and that's not true. Some of it went up the valleys, kept the hillside. Some went from hillside to hillside, and the valleys were green.
Yep.
So it's not like total destruction.
No, it's not. But I think about 80% of the areas that fire burned were actually, the canopy was lost. And so what you're talking about has more to do with fire ecology, and I think Lauren might be able to talk about
Yes.
fire regimes and how they.
Do you want me to do that?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. So depending on where you are and the forest type, so as Alex was talking about earlier, the different ecology of the type of forest that you're in will a lot of times dictate how a fire will respond. That a lot depends on the type of plants that are there and their ability to either reduce fire risk or perpetuate fire. And that has a lot to do with the resins and oils that are within those plants and the moisture levels within those plants. So I'm sure Alex will talk about it a little bit later when he's talking about defensible space. The deciduous trees have really high moisture, and they're a lot better to have in your defensible space than, say, a conifer tree because they have more resin, which perpetuate fire. The clumping and amount of fuels that are in a specific area, in combination with those plant types, will dictate how those fires move through the landscape. That, in combination with the topography of the landscape, as well as the amount of shade that's been there. So some shade and some moisture will cause the fire to burn around into small pockets. It can come back down to the ground into a surface fire. If there's areas where there's rock outcroppings or roads where things can't burn, if you have rocks and things, and so it will create a mosaic of fire throughout the landscape. However, there is a commonality in the way that fires burn in different ecotypes. So on the west side of the Cascades, we have typically a pretty thick Douglas fir forest. We have like a wet rainforest style in the Cascade, in the Coast Range. Alex was mentioning that fires come back every 150 to 300 years historically. And that's because conditions are really moist. It's hard to get a fire going. But that means that there's lots of lush, fine fuels in those forests. And so in the right conditions, when it's dry enough for a fire to get going, those forests burn really hot and fast in stand replacing conditions. That doesn't mean that there won't be pockets where the fire burns around and it's not stand replacing, it just burns as a surface fire. There's a mix of severities within each fire, but it has the higher risk of burning a big hot fire. On the east side of the mountains, in the, let's say in the Bend area, where there's typically ponderosa, wider spaced ponderosa pine forests, the limiting factor there is water. They just don't have as much water as we do. Those trees tend to grow further apart. There tends to be a lot more drier conditions and lightning strikes, where fires would happen more frequently, and that would burn the finer fuels that would create these louder conditions that would cause a canopy fire. And so when those fires burned through more frequently, it was less common that you would see a canopy fire there. And so that's sort of how the different ecology changes. And those would creep slowly around on the surface and not really get into the canopy at all very often, and make more space for smaller seedlings of those pine trees, and those trees to be more widely spaced with fewer shrubs. So those are sort of how, does that sort of answer your question? Or? Okay, great.
Yep, and that fire mosaic, you'll see that 100% of the time. If it's a huge canopy fire or if it's a surface fire, there's always going to be pockets where it doesn't burn, either because another part of the fire was occupying all the oxygen. Sometimes that's why certain areas won't burn, where the wind's blowing, what natural stuff is there.
So it sounds like our area here is a fire like every 100 years. How long has it been since we've had one? 150 years.
I'm going to
40 years.
Well, to sort of piggyback on what she was asking, if you typically had a fire every 150, 300 years, we're looking on this side of the Cascades where you have a rainforest. That rainforest is disappearing as far as rainforest. Drought conditions have gotten worse every single year. This forest is drying out. We're on this butte where by June you could walk around anywhere on this butte and everything is tinder dry. So it looks like, we're not seeing much progress to kind of, or enough research out there to show that there's a good plan and action for this climate change that we're experiencing.
We're going to touch on a lot of that, but what you said is basically that's true for most of the western U.S. You are seeing a drying trend. You're seeing more severe weather events, whether that's definitely a deviation from the norm. And we're going to talk about what that might mean for here and what we can do to address it, but it's definitely won't be solved by an individual house or even small community. This has got to be kind of a community county plan that we use to address this. But I think you see that with a lot of the duck firs that have been dying off. We're definitely in a drought. Okay, so getting back to our talk here. Okay, so here's the future wildfire, right? There's a study that came out in 2017, and it said large forest fires, this is, summarizing it here, large forest fires will continue to increase in both size and frequency. And some of the reasons that they listed for that are weather extremes. So we had 82 days without rain last year. That's an extreme. We had about a month longer fire season this year than we typically do, which is normally our fire season is only about 4 months. This last year was 5. So that's almost a 25% increase. We also see higher fuel loads, so we have not had those natural fires come through the area, and therefore we have higher fuel loading, so the risk of severe fire behavior or intense fire behavior is increasing the longer we do not address those fuels. And then we see increasing land use and recreation. So on the west side of I-5, 95% of our starts are human caused. When you get up into the Cascades, that's basically where the lightning starts hitting and goes over to Bend there. But on the west side of I-5 in Lane County, 95% of our starts are from humans. And so you see that in places like recreation. You see that Agriculture actually has a lot to do with that. They're out there, you know, mowing the grass and the humidity is really low, and they throw a spark, and that's how a lot of these things start. So, and then we also see this increased wildland urban interface, and so that has to do with the severity of the wildfire, you know, for a human population here. So, I'm not trying to scare you.
We are already.
Well, so what this map is showing, and I think we cut off a little bit there, but everything in orange here is the potential for flames to reach over 11 feet. Perfect. And what I said earlier, you know, typically when flames are 11 feet, we do not do direct attack. So we basically step back and we say, where can we try and catch this without going head on at this fire? And we're right up in here. 4 to 6 with a good wind, not easy to fight either. We typically lose those as often as we make gains on those depending on weather conditions. So all this is to show is, I mean, yes, we're living in a temperate rainforest. We have a lot of fuel out there, and we have taken the natural disturbance that reduces the amount of fuel, which is surface fire, out of the landscape, and so we kind of have this accumulated risk happening here. So the only real way that we can address this, so these are two different triangles. One is, you know, how do you start a fire? Oxygen, heat, and you need some type of combustible fuel. And then how does fuel behave on the landscape? What's burning? What's the weather doing? And, you know, how is it interacting with the topography? Out of all these, the only one that we can really manipulate is fuel. And so that's really what we're going to be focusing our time on today, and we're going to talk about that starting now. So, you know, show of hands, you know, most houses that burn down, the wildfire pushes through an area and burns that house down. Or B, a small ember lands in an area and burns that house down. Because it lands. B? I don't know if I said that, but yes, B. You're right. So,
I have a question.
yeah.
How many homes in western Lane County have been burnt by a forest fire in the last 20 years?
Last 20 years? I don't have that number, but I don't think it's too high.
I think it's probably 0. I talked to 3 different fire chiefs about 10 years ago, and they all said they did not know of a home that was burned down by a forest fire. They knew homes that were on fire started a forest fire, but not the other way around.
You know,
That's the big perspective.
Yeah, but last summer was really scary.
A big part of that, a big reason why we haven't seen that is we just have not had a large fire in the
True.
wildland urban interface.
True.
And we've gotten lucky there.
Yeah.
We've had about over 5,000 acre fires within miles of communities, Oak Ridge, Mackenzie Bridge, and there we also got lucky. It's true, it doesn't happen often here, but in California last year they lost close to 20,000. In Paradise it was probably the same thing. They had lost a home in a long time. So, but anyway, so virtually every house that starts from a small ember, landing in combustible material that can lead up to the house or is touching the house. So your biggest bang for your buck, if you're trying to make your space defensible, is removing those fine fuels. And I equate it basically like starting a campfire. If you've ever tried to start a campfire or a fireplace, and you put one big log on a piece of paper, you're going to have a hard time getting that log started. But you put a couple small pieces of sticks under there and a couple more pieces of paper, it's a lot easier to get that log started. Your house is essentially the log, and you want to remove all that fine fuel around your house. If you take away the kindling, it's hard to start that campfire.
What about the roof?
The roof is part of the house, and that's huge. Gutters, eaves, yeah, you want to clean those up. Shingles, yeah, if you have shake shingles, that can be an issue. But if you have composite or metal, clay, you're looking pretty good. Those are pretty fire.
So decks are pretty safe, aren't they?
Decks.
Everybody's got a deck here. So would that be the piece of wood, or would that be?
I'd say a deck is kind of that's a couple small twigs that you put next to the big log. And
Yeah, there's one right out here, wooden deck, that I've got to take out.
well, you can take them out. The other thing that I tell a lot of people with decks is just remove all that. If you have leaves that are accumulating underneath it or pine needles, remove those and consider putting a skirt so that embers can't fly under there, that's a pretty good solution too.
And also, we treat our decks, which are made of cedar, which is highly flammable, and we treat them with petroleum products to waterproof them. Protect them from rotting. So we just we have an additive effect.
I mean, the good news is an ember typically will not start a 2x4 on, it's hard to combust a 2x4 with one ember, but if you have a small pile of leaves next to that, that's where it becomes an issue.
So as long as we're on decks, then, I mean, like Lee was saying, we're thinking of whether to, replace our balcony and our wood deck. But the issue is more things get under it.
Correct.
And also if there's leaves next.
The issue is where can an ember land and start a fire? And typically, a lot of embers land in places and they just can't start a fire. Either it's too wet, the fuel that it lands on is just too large, and it'll go out before it actually starts. But if you have needles and leaves, a couple embers land in there, and that's a good way to get a fire going.
Yeah, so if there's a deck and you have maybe a small pine tree next to the deck, or bushes that have pine needles, that kind of plants, should you just remove them?
I'll get into that in a second.
Okay.
And typically I do not advise on having arborvitae, juniper, or general conifers touching the house. If you want to have them outside of 30 feet or even 15, 20 feet away, especially if they're smaller, I think that can definitely be safe. But typically I don't advise having those touching houses or decks. Okay, so here are the 3 zones of defensible space. And someone was asking about, what about the leaves on your roof? And I actually think it'd be pretty fun to hang out in that cabin for a weekend, do a little backpacking trip, and but I might not. If there was like a fire in the area, I probably wouldn't want to stay there. And if you look, it has moss and then an accumulation of I don't know if that's shingles or it might be like a moss grass roof. Anyways, if an ember landed on that, that's what we call an ember bed. And an ember bed is exactly that. It's where an ember can lay and start a fire. So if your roof looks like that, that'd be the first place I would start. Start with your roof. No matter what, the first place to really look for is zone 1. So if you go back to your house today, or you're trying to assess your defensible space, the most crucial part is what is around your house. What's on your house in your gutters? Are there trees there? What's underneath your decks? What's planted that's touching your house? And then, so that's zone 1, is what's within that 30-foot zone. 30 feet. But start with 5 feet. On the roof and what's touching your house, and then move out from there. Okay. So 30 feet is zone 1, and typically what we call that is lean, clean, and green. And basically what that means is you do not have combustible material in that 30-foot zone. And when I say combustible material, I mean fine dead leaf litter, an accumulation of dead branches, mostly dead vegetation, but then also some of that arborvitae, and you were asking about conifer species. If they're touching your house, I wouldn't recommend that. And if they're touching your house, definitely not leading down the bark or mulch. That could also take a ember. And so a lot of people put bark around their houses. If you have a sprinkler system set up and that bark stays moist year round, it's not going to accept an ember, and that's not going to start a rager. But what we're really going to start looking at here is the continuity of fuel, right? So we talked about the horizontal and vertical arrangement of fuel. What we don't want to have happen anywhere within zone 2 is for an ember to land in zone 2 and be able to work its way to the house. And that just first zone, typically we want that fire to stop on that red line. If it's creeping around on the ground in some tall grass or pine needles, that's okay outside the 30-foot zone. But we don't want it to get inside there. All right.
How about the dead leaves?
What about the
Dead leaves around your house, and that should be cleaned out, right?
So
What do you
right
do
here,
to that right now?
dead leaves in your gutter, dead leaves next to, especially if this was a wood, but even if it wasn't a wood deck, clean that stuff out, because that's where. So those embers actually travel up to a mile away from a flame front, depending on weather conditions. So you could have a fire that's a mile away, but that's sending out embers that could potentially land in your defensible space. That is a lot more likely than a fire racing and your house is directly in that path. Because the probability of that's probably relatively low. But the probability of having a fire in your area and sending out a whole bunch of embers, a lot higher than a big rager going right through your place.
What about if the road that you live on has trees?
Yep. So access is something that we look at, and everything that we're talking about here has to do with, in the event of a fire, right? And so in the event of a fire, if you do not have good access, that can be a problem for you getting out. That can be a problem for fire trucks, response personnel getting in. Typically, we say 13 feet high and at least 12 feet wide. That's what we want the access to be for fire response personnel. We also do vegetation management on the side of that road, so we'll do a little bit of thinning, taking out dead, if you've got dead branches and all this kind of stuff, taking those out within 10 to 15 feet of that road is a good idea. In the event that a fire is on that road, you can still pass that without it engulfing the entire road.
Is that the 10, 15 feet at either side of the road, is that what you're saying?
Yeah. So 10 feet from the side of the road, just taking out some. If you've got a large conifer there, then branches are going straight down to the ground, maybe you prune some of those out. Yeah.
Don't all the roads just aren't they like easy pickings for being natural fire breaks?
They can be. Absolutely.
It would seem like if everybody's doing their own thing, that's fine. But in the big picture, if every road is a defensible space, basically.
That's a lot of what we work on. Yep, and I mean, those can end up being contingency lines. So, if a fire is going to a certain area, you have a road, that's definitely something that we hold all the time. When we are on fires, we'll be fighting fire from the road because it's a nice 10 to 15 foot section that isn't going to burn. But we got.
I just wanted to add, for the roads, a lot of people who are doing some forest management on larger properties where you do have some roads, we use those as what we call shaded fuel breaks. So I was talking about earlier where there's forests with more moisture sort of help to bring fire to the ground and work along the surface. Roads are a great place to do that. Keep your canopy high where there's a lot of moisture underneath. A lot of fires do start on roads, and so if you can thin out the shrubs and decrease that continuity of fuel next to your roads for that 10 to 20 feet, then if a fire is coming towards the road, you have that additional break there that can help bring it down to the ground and make it move more slowly and stick back to a surface fire as opposed to that ground fire that moves more. And when you go back to the last slide. So I just want to, this picture here is this is a great photo, and just something, there's been a lot of research on how houses start during wildfires, and one of the key concepts is that, yes, this is the composite, thank you. The composite, and this is great in terms of fire safety for embers landing on it. But if you have this fuel, what's underneath this composite? Plywood. Right, and insulation. How flammable is that, right? So don't just think about what's on the surface. Think about where these materials meet. And that's the key point in where you're cleaning up these fire fuels. If you can only focus on all of it if you can, but at the very least, focus on a lot of places where these materials meet, because usually it's a space where you see insulation or plywood or something that's a little bit easier to ignite than what we recommend putting on the surface. So this is a really important part of where you clean. So just wanted to add that.
Before you move on, you mentioned even bark. I presume when you mentioned bark near the house, you're also talking about bark of mulch. How far away from the house should it be?
So his question was, how far should you put bark mulch away from your house? You don't need much. Bark mulch typically doesn't burn hot. It just it has an ember, so it holds heat and it can move through it, right? So if you even have 12 to 18 inches away from your house, away from your decks, likely that's going to be enough so that bark mulch burns up to that non-combustible part and stops there. Ideally, 5 feet. But 18 will be, that'll get you started. And again, I wouldn't even worry about that stuff until you got a handle on this type of stuff here. Yeah.
Along with the gutter, talking about adding the size of the squares on your screen
Yep.
should be 1/8 inch or less.
Should be 1/8 inch or less. So one thing about these embers, right? These embers act a lot like snowflakes. So if you guys ever been in a blizzard?
Yeah.
Right, okay. So that's how these guys act. And when there's an active fire in the area or close to, there's a lot of this stuff flying around. And it's not just one that lands and starts, it's an entire, it's a blizzard of embers and so his question was how, what type of openings can you have in your house? Well, 1/8 inch or less is what you want to have for screening on any exposed. So it's happened where you got great defensible space, but you have your attic that's got a nice, open for ventilation. Embers get into there, and now you've got a fire on the inside of the house, even though you've got great defensible space on the outside. So 1/8 inch or less mesh screening is a good thing to attach to any large openings that you have on your house. But I'm going to keep going here. Are we kind of getting an idea of what we want for zone 1?
I have a question. The picture in the lower left, is that a home that was properly defensible? Everything around it is all burned up.
I would say this guy had enough defensible space to get the job done.
Yeah.
That's a good picture.
Yeah.
What about telling people not to put their air conditioner on so they don't suck in embers?
Oof, that's a good one. His question was, what about having an air conditioner on or some type of air intake so you don't pull embers in? I don't know. What I have heard is, your propane tanks, to have those, I think, actually half full is safer than empty. Because the gas, there's more space for that gas to expand if it's empty. So, if that's an answer to the question.
I would say be safe, and if you're told to leave, just leave. But if you have, if there's a wildfire situation, there's usually a warning that's saying, okay, we're in the get ready phase. Start to collect your things for if it's time to go. And during that, you have your checklist, and if you have time where it's safe for you to turn things off, like air intakes and propane tanks and things like that, then do that on your way out. If not, stay safe and just go.
Yeah,
Definitely kind of shutting down
it
the
is a
house.
recommendation. Just want to get your
Shutting down the house before you go is definitely a good call. And the other thing that a lot of people, sometimes forget, like polyester seat cushions, if you have those on your deck, pull those, put them on the inside. Put them on the inside of your house where they can't catch an ember. That's another big one. Polyester goes up, that'll start a deck on fire.
The awning that we have up there looks like a bad thing.
It's rolled up. I think, these are all just steps to take. So the one thing I don't want to do is have every single one of you go home and completely every step is about mitigating risk. Some risk you're going to want to live with. I think that'll roll it up, not that.
Can a lot of these things be mitigated through like a home fire suppression system, whether that be DIY or professionally installed sprinklers powered by generators?
So his question was, can you put a sprinkler system or a home defense system with water around your house, and can that solve a lot of these issues? It definitely doesn't hurt. And that's typically what we will do to houses when we're not there actively, is we'll set up sprinklers with a porta pump, and we'll just let that go. What that does, it increases the humidity in the area, it dampens stuff, so less embers can actually start. And yeah, that is a good idea. The one caveat there would be, if the water or power sources hit, then that's, if you have a generator or something like that, that might help. But I tell people all the time, if you can put a sprinkler on your house before you leave too, I do that. And typically I aim that for the roof. So,
That's why he's saying generator. You have a generator.
Power will get that.
I have a question about zone 1 and the large trees that any of us have in that area. I mean, they would sound like they'd be canopy fire items if they're moved up. But I'm curious, where things that are touching the house or overhanging the house have to be handled, have to be removed, or whatever we got to do. But we've got giant trees all around, and we're thinking of removing a ton of them. Just
well,
like
the one,
what do you think?
I'm really glad you asked that question. I don't think I've addressed that yet. What Lauren said earlier about a canopy being a good thing because it raises the relative humidity is really true. So when we do our treatments, we never take out, we never create gaps in the canopy. So the more gaps that there are in the canopy, the more sunlight gets in, the more brush problem you have on the ground, the quicker things dry out. What we will sometimes do, if it's really crowded, we'll space out some of those trees. And that's typically when we thin, we don't create any gaps that can't be filled in by the adjacent trees in 2 to 3 years. Because we don't want that brush to be accumulated. If you have large conifers around your house, and you're thinking about cutting down, I would say, don't have your branches, big, large limbs within 8 feet of your house. But if you can limb up limbs so the canopy of your tree is starting 10, 15 feet away from your house, if a canopy fire rolls through an area, typically that canopy will burn in less than 60 seconds. The arrangement of the fuel on a fir tree, you think about thousands of needles, there's a lot of surface area, there's not much volume there, and it has some resinous compounds that are flammable. So those things, once they get going, you throw a fir tree on a fire, if it's green, it'll still burn pretty quick. That stuff burns through within a minute. Typically a house will take up to 10 minutes to combust. Wood siding house. So if it's not touching your house and you have enough safe distance, I wouldn't look at taking out large trees to increase safety.
You're talking of limbing up, so you're saying limbing up higher, 10 feet higher than your house?
If you have a large, let's say you have a 60-foot conifer.
Okay, so let's just say you don't have, so
Okay.
you have lots of trees around your house,
Yeah.
so you're gonna limb up for fire safety, and you want your canopy to stay there. How high do you limb up?
You want it at least 8 feet away from your house.
Right.
So wherever that needs to be is how far I limb up. Typically, you can't limb up a tree more than 1/3. Help me out, is it?
Yeah, you don't want to remove more than 50% of the canopy at one time.
So the problem with having the trees in your canopy around your house is still every time the wind blows, like every week or two, you're going to have your gutters full of needles. So
And that's a personal.
that's a trade-off. How often do you want to clean your gutters? Because every time the wind blows, you're going to have needles in your gutters.
And
If
a
your
couple
trees are that close.
of needles, it's when those needles are, it creates a
3 inches
map
deep.
and actually have continuous accumulation. But if you have a couple needles on your roof, that's not really gonna be, an issue.
And some of that's being strategic about time of year. So if it's, end of fire season, you don't have to, you never know what's going to happen, But typically at the end of fire season, you can take a little break. And then as we rev up towards fire season, in the May time frame, it's Fire Awareness Month. That's a great time to get out and start doing a lot of your fire prevention work. Then, start your work then, and then as you get those mats continuously cleaned out. So take a little break.
I want to answer all these questions, but I'm just concerned that I got a decent amount to go through. Do you mind if we keep going through this and then we say questions?
Keep going.
Okay. All right. All right, so zone 2, 75 feet. What we don't want in zone 2 is continuous fuel leading up to the house. If you had a pocket of this in zone 2, that's fine. We just do not want it all connected. So the issue with connectivity again is anywhere it never lands in that field, now that whole field becomes a fire, or has a potential to. If you create islands, then that island becomes a fire, but it goes back down before racing up to your house. Okay. This is not a good picture. I'm not going to spend time on it. Basically, zone 3 is that forest stand improvement health that Lauren could probably talk to you about after this. Pre-commercial thinning suppressed trees, removing ladder fuels. That's the type of stuff that you would do outside of 75 to 100 feet from your house. If you live on a hill, that 150-foot buffer can be pushed to 200. All right, and so now we're at this question, well, you've got 200 feet. Some of you may have a neighbor within 200 feet. Okay. And that's exactly what we saw happen a lot in California, is if you have a house within 30 feet, which is that initial structured combustion zone, and that house starts on fire, there's enough fuel in a house that within 30 feet, that house has a high risk to combust your house unless there's fire personnel there. And that's likely what happened to a lot of these. Maybe let's say this guy had great defensible space, this guy didn't. Ember lands on his property, his house goes, then this guy's goes, and so on. And that's really where we're going to start talking about FireWise communities, is it becomes kind of a joint effort when you have houses in close proximity to other houses.
So what's Oregon State Bill 36?
Oh, yeah. So Oregon Senate Bill 360 is actually, this is a law in Oregon that requires you to manage the hazardous fuels on your property. And basically what it says is if there's a fire that starts on your property or you're found negligent with the fire moving through your property, you could be held partially responsible for that fire. If you do your defensible space and you manage hazardous fuels on your property, generally that's what this law is saying you need to do. And it's really important in these areas and the wild and urban interface where houses start forest fires and things like that. Does that make sense? Okay.
Has it ever been enforced or ever been proved? How do you prove something like that?
Well, if your house starts and you haven't touched any of the fuel around your house and you've got forestry behind it, I mean, you can tell generally where a fire starts. I mean, we have fire investigators, and so they can generally identify how a fire starts, or at least where it starts. And if it started on your property and you were found negligent, that can be an issue, especially if it burns, if you're living next to a large forest tract, which are worth quite a bit sometimes. But anyways, that's just to say that this is built into our law, and the idea is to get people to be proactive about it.
Is that personal property?
Yes.
Okay, that's not like the big going on fire and then the city's responsible for our house. That's
I don't know.
And if it's
This is
personal
personal
property, yeah,
property.
yeah.
Okay, so FireWise communities, simple definition there. Sweet. Community in a defined geographic area and having the preference of their house not being built by flames. Well, I guess by that definition, we are all FireWise communities. Well, the caveat there is that you take proactive steps, and it really is, it's a community thing, right? It's put on by NFPA, which is the National Fire Protection Association. It's really a way to kind of do the things that we're doing right here, which is just get together and take some proactive steps and mitigate the risk in your community. So these are the requirements of a FireWise community, and I think we have, let's just say this was a FireWise community here. Well, this counts as our education outreach event. Definitely. All right. I bet there's a FireWise board here, which is 3 or more people that will, oversee it. And invest a little time. And when I say a little, I do mean little. This is not someone's going to come and inspect. This is a way for you guys to get organized and get empowered to be proactive in your community. So invest a little time, 1 hour per household per year on fire prevention. That includes cleaning out your gutters before fires here. All right, I bet everyone here has hit that 10, 100 times over this year. So it's not. And then the action plan, which is basically, I would come out, I'd conduct a community assessment. And that community assessment is basically just kind of the hazards as we see them as a risk for that community. And then you guys, based on the hazards that I identified. So let's say that the zone 1 really needed a lot of work on a lot of homes. I would identify that on the hazard risk assessment. I'd say, look, zone 1's not looking so good. We gotta bump that up. That would go in your action plan. And you say, by year 1, we want to have 50% of zone 1 defensible space for the properties that are in our community. It's really a way to just get people to come together and start this community planning, because this helps for a couple houses in an area, maybe up to 2,000. But it'd be tough for this to help in a case like the camp fire. And so that's what we're going to talk about now. Does anyone have any questions before we get going? I think we're good. We're going to keep going. No questions. Okay, all right. 2018 camp fire. So this was the deadliest, most destructive wildfire in California's history. And there was a couple key reasons for that. It had a lot of this going on, the wind-driven embers. And this is actually concrete here, concrete there, and concrete there. This is that little patch of a tree planting on the side of the street, and that's how many embers are coming off that one little area. So this is really, this is basically continuous fire right here. That's how many embers, and when you get into an event like that, it can really, there can be a lot of heat associated with these little guys. So it was about 90 miles east of Sacramento, and one of the reasons that made Paradise so impacted by this was the time that fire started. So by 10:45 a.m., It was in the city. It started at night, so by the time it was getting close to the city, most people were just waking up. So that's so having a plan in the event of what are your options for leaving an area, having that sorted out beforehand really makes a big difference. This is the progression of the fire. So blue is basically less than 24 hours, and this is Paradise right here. So by 10:30 it was here, and 24 hours ago it hadn't even started. It was moving. The flame front at one point was moving 100 yards per second.
Because of the wind.
Great question. How was it moving that fast? Well, California has this thing called Santa Ana winds, and when this fire started, the Santa Ana winds were pushing this way. And so you can kind of see how that fire is fanning out that way. 65-mile-an-hour winds. And so when you have 65-mile-an-hour winds behind a fire with less than 20% relative humidity and 3% of the average rainfall for the month before, on steep terrain with combustible vegetation, you have a recipe for disaster. FireWise communities may not have mattered as much here as we might think. Because when you have 65-mile-an-hour winds, that is moving so quick that the ability to respond is really limited. The other thing that we have is a 20% relative humidity. So typically in Lane County, if we have relative humidity less than 30%, we kind of see fire activity become an issue. So, when we're on the compound and we hear, well, relative humidity, it's 3 o'clock and relative humidity is 28%, we're kind of like, okay, if we get a fire, let's hope to catch it quick, or let's hope it's burning in something that's has more moisture than relative air does, because that could become an issue. Well, they had less than 20%, and then they had less than 3% of their average rainfall. So these are really, it's more than a trifecta of bad conditions that led up to this. So this is the map of what structures were lost. Red is lost, and yellow is major. But so, basically 95% of the town was consumed in this fire. Over 18,000 structures, over 85, civilian casualties. And the thing that I want to point out here is, so someone was asking about, well, certain areas burn, certain areas don't burn. If we're blowing up this little area right here, and this is what that map looks like, and these are actually these houses on Google Earth before that fire came through. Black means those houses survived, red means those houses didn't. So you look at this house right here, depending on how long the vegetation was around the house, or how well the defensible space is, you would think that would normally do pretty okay, right? It's in an open field. If they got the grass cut short, well, what you have right here is a valley. There's kind of like a little ravine right here, and the predominant wind was going this way. So if they didn't have 150 feet of shortcut grass and defensible space, that's probably why this guy was lost. But then you look at this guy, and he's in the middle of trees, and there was no visible damage on this one. So my guess is that came down to what was within 30 to 150 feet of these houses. And also had a lot to do with 65-mile-an-hour winds. This guy was at the top of the valley that had
So, like in our area here, when we're on the peak, one question I had is, if we're thinking of what area when we're talking about actually clearing the forest, like you have 20 or 40 acres or whatever, how likely is it that the fire will come downhill?
It's a good question. So typically fire likes to run uphill. It's one of the few things it does. It preheats the fuel above it, and that's why fire is more active going uphill. Fire can run downhill, so typically if you have air that's moving downhill, that will drive a fire downhill. Typically in the summer, our winds come out of the northwest, east sometimes. The east winds are really the ones to look out for because they have a really low relative humidity. They're coming from the desert. But so for a fire to really race this way, you need a south wind, and it'd have to be pretty dry for it to really gain steam. So I would say on this side, definitely less likely. But the case of it down here, pushing that way is probably a little higher.
Does the canopy slow down the wind? Is that Did those trees there maybe help that house?
It could, 65-mile-an-hour winds are that's pretty ridiculous. I think our average is, our average highs in the summer are 10 to 12, maybe.
It also comes down to when preheating the trees and driving out the trees in front of it. So as you lose the wind, it causes the moisture in those future fuels to dissipate more quickly and therefore ignite faster. So that's sort of how it works.
It is possible that those trees had more moisture in them. Maybe they did some watering before they left, and that could have combated that fire a little bit.
A friend who was on the campfire noted that most of the houses that survived had 3 or 4 foot exposed foundations. So there was no dirt or plant contact to the siding on the side of the house. So that was his observation, was that an exposed foundation around the house provided a great protection, circle around the house.
That's, what Lauren said about where those connections are, underneath wood siding. When you have the amount of embers that you would on a large fire like this, driven at the rate of the wind speeds, those connections really become important. And if you do have a little bark mulch next to that, that could have been, the difference between.
I have a friend who worked for me this summer, and he was on the California fire the year before, and he said when people had their wooden and especially cedar fences, and he said he watched that fire go from one backyard to the next. That cedar fence was like a row of kindling, and it just sucked that fire right through those backyards.
It's a good point. If a cedar fence is connected to your house, that's technically part of your house. So then your 30-foot zone becomes what's around that cedar fence.
You put your cedar fence under your trees, your cedar fence is already 6 feet high, and then it easily gets to 11-foot flames underneath your canopy trees.
So my wife thinks I'm stupid.
We don't have enough time for all of this.
What I want to do, King says that, Kyle King says that if Spencer Peak goes, we're all screwed. But what you're saying is not jive with that. So my wife thinks I'm stupid because I want to get a mitigation system to sprinkle around the house rather than fight the fire in the forest. So you're saying if you reduce the fire risk of the flammable around your house, you're really doing a good job. So she's I'm right.
So she.
Would you sign?
Can you rephrase it?
I'm going to catch the roof rain in a 500-gallon tank, have a pump, have a pump attached to a hose, and spray around the house.
Just sit up there.
I mean, I'm probably jumping way ahead, but what's so wrong with that? Is there anything wrong with that?
The point that I want to make with the Paradise, with the campfire in California is, this was a perfect storm for a wildfire.
Yeah.
Okay? And 99% of the time, we're not going to have 6 really important factors line up against us perfectly. And Paradise saw it happen, and that was an absolutely terrible thing. But 9 times out of 10, if you have your defensible space set,
I mean, to catch those embers,
yeah,
which are the most likely to cause your house to burn.
Sure. If you reduce the fine fuels around your house and you have a high relative humidity by water or something like that, you stand a much better chance of surviving your average event, let's say Spencer's Peak going out, than you would if you did not.
If you don't mind taking other questions, fire gel. Some of the more expensive homes have covered themselves with fire gel.
That's a good question. We use fire retardant in our pumping system sometimes. Oh yeah, I'm sorry. So he said fire gel, and that's something that you would spray in your house in the event of fire coming through. And that's basically all fire gel is it's something that holds on to its moisture longer than if you were to just spray your roof with water. And so that is good because you're going to have a longer time of a higher humidity around your house. So that's good. It's definitely going to work better than water if you do it, if it's used the way it's intended.
Time if you're home, if you're not over the coast or something, I mean, you have to be there.
Yeah. And then the other question is where would you put that? And so If you had fire gel, but you had fine fuel next to the, corners of your cedar shake that went straight down into bark mulch, you could put fire gel on the entire side of your house, and if you had that exposed dry material right underneath your siding, well, that's the most likely place an ember's going to land.
We have a couple big models of it, and it just goes on with a garden hose, if you have the time to do it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would just say that would use that as your primary strategy. It's a good thing to, if you have the time and you want to use that as a secondary source, by all means. I think sometimes they use that during firefighting if they can't get to a house or actively fight in front of a house. They'll go spray some houses. Just take note to be really careful as you're putting it on. If you miss a spot, that spot's not as fire resistant as where you do spray. So be cognizant as you put it on, make sure you're hitting everything that's...
And your timing has to be right, because it's only good for about 72 hours, and so it's sort of be a zone, level 2,
right.
not a level 1, and...
Your best bet would still be removing all the combustible material.
I didn't say it's
and
an
if you
option,
wanted
not as an option, but as an addition.
The fire gel holds moisture longer than water would on its own, so in that respect, it would probably do a better job in that area.
This gentleman alluded to something about, getting a pump and, fighting the fire yourself. And so I'm just wondering, is that a logical idea to maybe have your own fire hydrant and a big, hose?
I would just add to that, our goal is for you to stay safe, and so if you're not trained on staying in an area during a fire, we recommend you go. But what would be really helpful is putting non-flammable signs up for firefighters as to where those water resources are. So saying, I have a 2,500 gallon cistern of water with a pump in right to 200 feet with an X with an arrow saying where it is. And so when if firefighters run out of water or need more water, they know where to go to be able to get that to help fight the fire for you.
I have a zone one question again, which is for green shrubs that are adjacent to the house, like rhodiums or other things like that, would that be a high priority, or should I go out there with my little electric chainsaw and cut those down, or not?
Get them out of there. If you have it watered and you have all that dead vegetation taken off, again, these are all just, everything that we're talking about here are steps that you can take. You definitely by no means have to take every single one of them, because you could take every single one of them and an event like Paradise could happen, and it might not work out the way that you were intending. If you have watered green vegetation that's not a conifer, and you don't have any dead vegetation, and they're not touching your house, I would say that's a low priority. Yeah, rododendrons. Typically, broadleaf vegetation is less flammable than conifers.
So
I'm going to go back to EDS one.
Do you know what the breakdown of what the cause of the casualties was? How many of those were homebound people? How many of those were people trying to defend their houses? Do you have any clue?
I don't. I know that there was quite a few that left too late, got caught. I know that there's a relatively large percentage who just weren't aware of the issue in time. And I don't know the exact numbers.
Okay, so for our group here, if you're told to evacuate, please evacuate. Okay, I know we're talking about staying back and defending our houses, but that puts a lot of people at risk that don't need to be at risk.
But part of the problem with Murdoch Road is
So we have evacuation levels, right? And so if there's a fire in the area, we have the first evacuation is get ready. The second one is get set, and then the third one is go. right? And if you're not ready to set by the time go comes around, well, you should be, right? By the time go comes around, if there was a fire in the area and I had defensible space, I'd probably be, well, I might be suiting up, but I would definitely not be hanging around to see the flame fronts come over the, the hill there.
Probably gonna go on and get set.
I think we're already-
I just wanted to ask you, how do people find out, so if there's a fire in the area, how do people find out what level you're at? Like if you're at get ready or get set?
Do we have that emergency text system set up now?
We do, you have to be signed up for it though, so it's important to sign up for it if you can. If there's a link to it on the SBNA website. They will do reverse 911, but it may be too late. In Paradise, it was they had reverse 911, but it was way too late and not enough people had landlines. So reverse 911 typically only works on landlines.
I
You don't have
thought
a
we
landline
signed
anymore.
up for one on our cell phone.
Yeah, you did.
We did sign up.
Okay, then you're good.
Sign up.
Do you have a question over here?
I don't believe the group has honored their request to go on with their presentation.
Well, we're getting to the end of the year, all right? And the final thing that I want to say is, what was the lesson learned from Paradise, right? And so the lesson is, when conditions are right, fire can really be quite catastrophic. I said FireWise communities and defensible space may not have mattered as much in that scenario as they would in virtually all other normal fire scenarios. And when I say normal, I mean the perfect storm. But the one thing that would have really helped them would have been a community wildfire protection plan that had the community support, was thought out, and had been planned years before. And in my mind right now, we're in a fire environment, and we have the opportunity to do quite a bit of pre-planning. Pre-planning is always better than reacting. And this community wildfire protection plan is for the community, really the entire county, but specifically the south hills of Eugene and the wildland urban interface around Eugene and Springfield, to come up with a plan that addresses these types of wildfire events. And that plan involves a suite of different tools, right? So landscape regulations, we have Senate Bill 360 for Oregon, which basically says you're supposed to take out the hazardous fuel. You're supposed to manage your property for hazardous fuel. But there's other things like county codes. There's a whole bunch of regulation. For example, structural fire protection for a long time has been trying to get a code into the county that limits the grade a house driveway can be. If it's over 20% for any longer than 100 feet or so, they have a hard time getting up there. Well, that really prevents them from doing their job. And that's a simple code, especially for new houses, that we could put in place and say, great, every new house that's built now, at the very least, a fire truck can get up and access that area. Turnaround areas, stuff like that. These are a lot of things that currently are vacant in our community planning. And that's just one example, but there's a lot of these examples that if we start chipping away at this, we're going to be a lot better prepared if and when that type of event happens. We are currently. Another thing that we can do is, so building codes, shake roofs in the wildland urban interface really shouldn't be. They shouldn't be a thing. If you're grandfathered in, but when you go to replace a roof, I don't think that we should be able to have shake roofs. Why? It occupies a lot of firefighting resources. In fact, when we go through an area and there's an active fire, we'll put numbers on houses. And we rate houses based on how defensible they are. 1 means, yeah, this house is pretty defensible. If we stay here, we're likely to save it. 2 means, if we have time to stick around, we might be able to save this thing. 3 means higher priorities, drive on by.
Can we erase those?
How do we know?
If you do defensible space within 150 feet, when we drive by, we're going to say that's a good defensible space. If I'm looking at this house right now, I'd say this house would probably get a 1. It's got cut. It's not perfect. But the grass that leads up to it is less than 4 inches, so it's cut short. If it's cut short in the summer, that means fires are going to really be able to hold through there. It has well-spaced trees, but it has a canopy. It's got a lot of oak forest around here. We don't have dense conifer reaching right up. There might be a little problem on that back house. I think that back, I don't know if that's a house or a shed. The Padre Studio might get a 2 or 3 just because of the proximity that it is to that Doug fir forest. But these are the types of things that we should kind of come together as a community. I mean, what we're doing here is great. Education is the first part, and then once we agree on what we are or are not willing to do, I think we gotta take this to the next level, which is that plan. Yeah, let me, I'm almost through this and then, okay. All right, so we hit building code, subdivision design. That's a big reason why the California campfire was so devastating. We had those houses within 30 feet of each other, right? And up here, you guys don't have that, but if we're doing urban infill, there should be something in place to say, let's do urban infill that also addresses this wildfire risk. All right, and then, watershed management plans and obviously reducing hazardous fuel in the landscape, especially around properties, is something that ODF works on quite a bit. And we're actually in the process right now of revisiting our CWPP. We only have ever had one. It was in 2006. Most of you may not have known, but it has not been touched since then. But it identified areas of high risk, and it's time for an update. So if you're wondering about something to do on a larger scale, I would say get in touch with your local officials and say, hey, what about this? Can we get a wildfire protection plan together? Can we get proactive about this fire risk that we have? And then a lot of this stuff can kind of work into a triple bottom line. So I realize that wildfire risk is not the only concern when we start talking about community planning, but there are ways that we can incorporate smart planning in regards to wildfire risk with other community objectives. Triple bottom line meaning economic, social, and ecological, right? And so oak forests, oak savannas could be, if they were, they might not be as ecological as you might want them, but if an oak savanna was mowed beginning fire season, and there's a short swath, that could actually be a pretty nice fuel break, especially if it had access. And so these are the types of things that we should really be looking at trying to solve, or trying to at least put in place, so when we develop a new area, or as we expand, we've got a good plan to address these concerns. And had they had a good one of those, Paradise may look substantially different.
Okay, I'm going to bring that up for us only because, as you say, fires go uphill. We have a city plan right below us in trees that I don't see as at all enforced for dispensable spaces. Does the city have a plan?
I call them.
I have called them, and actually we're meeting with them in a week, because that is, for me, I know we're terrified about the park, but when you drive just down around the edge of the school, all of those trees and all of those wooden houses with cedar shakes roofs, it's terrifying.
The other thing I'd like to say about the community wildfire protection plan is it's going to have to be a collaborative approach. And ODF, the city of Eugene, those two guys alone, or all the public management, there's not enough resources. We actually haven't. There's nothing in the budget that says a portion of your taxes are going to wildfire prevention. We're not paying for any of that right now. So there's a lack of capacity in the county, in the city, and in our community in general, and that's because we have not properly evaluated. They have a lot of plans, and a lot of them are ecological.
Right.
In certain ecological places, you're not going to want to do a lot of heavy fire prevention stuff, but it might make sense to do those where you don't have houses 30 feet above the shade. But they are aware of it, and they do a lot of fuel reduction. It sounds like that one might be.
Alex, can you speak about the roads, the access, Fox Hollow, South Willamette, what we got in arterial. But a lot of Murdoch, Klein, Owl, these are single lane roads, Fox Ridge. I mean, I'm just kind of curious about, can we get out, would you guys, when you're rating a house 1, 2, 3, would you even go up those roads? I mean, I'm curious.
The longer a one-way road, the longer and more narrow a one-way road is, the less likely we're going to be to go into that place. If you have that reduced fuel on each side of that road, and you don't have a wall of green right next to the road, we're a lot more likely to go down it than we would be if you had wall-to-wall vegetation on each side.
And I remember hearing that you have to be able to turn the fire truck around in case you have to get out of there. You need a place big enough to turn the truck around.
If you have a long single-way driveway, even putting a turnaround halfway up or something, that's sometimes good enough to be like, okay, well, we know we can back down this 200 feet to get to that turnaround. But if it's a quarter mile long, we don't see a single turnaround.
You can use a hammerhead for a turnaround, not a big circle, right?
It depends on the type of vehicle that we're using. You guys have some pretty long.
We will bring in type 6s though, so it'll be big pickups.
So our type 6s are large pickups, they're Dodge 4500s, they have a water tank on back. You know, those guys would probably go in and check it out before anything large came in.
But then it's water sources the issue. So if there's water sources, and that's one of the things we're gonna talk about next week with the Eugene Fire Chief is, have you mapped out the water sources and can we help you with that? Because we need to do that.
So on those roads, there's a big reference, is it, how much footage on the side of the road is owned by the county?
That's another thing that we'd like, you know, I'm working heavily with the county right now and the city to address some of these issues. Because a lot of this is, you know, it's county right up to the road and you don't really have the authority or access to go in there. But, you know, that might be a situation where we get something together that would say, well, if it's more defensible space and you have a pre-approved plan by ODF or another wildfire, you know, expert, then maybe the county would allow that to take place without, you know, them coming with
Who would I call to find out about clearing trees that are right next to the road? Lee County.
I think it might be Lake County.
Deer back here, what'd you say?
Okay, contact, road clearing.
Well, so before we ask anyone, I just want everyone to know that's pretty much, you know, this is pretty much all I have. So if you do want to stick around for the questions, we'll keep going. But, okay, right here.
Thank you.
Oh, actually, before we get back into
In
it,
case anybody is not going to stick around, looks like you're going to stick around. In case anybody is not, would you please make sure you sign the sign-in sheet that is around some over there? Could you send it out? So if you haven't signed up, please sign so we know who's here and we're here. Thank you. Okay, great case.
I have a question.
yes.
Which basically is there any kind of money source, grants, whatever? How, for instance, I got massive laying down in my woods below my house. I'm aware of it. It's there. There's dead trees and they're exactly like the picture. But I don't have the resources right now to pay to get that pulled out.
Right now, the only source of funding that we have in the county is grant funding. It's grant limited. So I personally will write for grants to be able to send a fuel crew out to reduce fuel around homes and properties. I believe Eastern Lane is the same thing. Eastern Lane is basically to the east of I-5.
So what is the process for me to do that?
Well, I can only write for 1 year, and so it fills up pretty fast.
FireWise.
1 grant a year. No.
Would you include the information about being able, if we start FireWise with more everybody under this month, he has wonderful, that you will send crew out to help with this.
So we have funds that typically last a crew for a season and a half of full-time work. And that crew of 4 will go around to different properties and help create defensible space. There's a maintenance plan for that, so if you get this crew to come out, you have to maintain it for 10 years. You have to maintain what we do for 10 years. So there's a long-term maintenance plan that's associated with what we do. Let's hear it real quick.
So when I want to clear our land, it's very moist. We have some swamp area even, but the fire season kicks in and they block using my chainsaw and decent hours.
The best time to do fuel reduction is actually in the winter, and that's for a number of reasons. Ecologically, birds haven't begun to nest. It's generally a good time to be out in the woods in the winter. A lot of things are going. I would generally say that's the best way to get around that. We haven't.
But it's so muddy, I tear up my woods as doing it. So, secondly, I want to talk about getting out of here. Talk about the fire. How are we going to get out of here? You've got a lot of cars parked here. Hopefully nobody has blocked the driveway. But, okay, driveway's open still. But I'll help anybody who's stuck in the mud
or there are a couple of cards that are questionable.
All right, so to get back to the original question, and I just had a new one that fits perfectly into it. So the original question was, we have funding, how does that work? How do you get on the list? Another question I had was, well, can you come by and at least evaluate, my property, inspect it for defensible space? Inspecting a property for defensible space is something I can do pretty easily. That's a matter of me going out to your property, doing a walk around and saying, okay, these are the points that I would pay attention to. Getting funding for this is a little bit more complicated. We're basically we're on the end of our funding for this area. So if you guys live around Spencer, we no longer have funding. We basically have already signed up with communities and individuals. We're on the last year, we're on the fifth year grant, which is just we're at the end. We write grants every year. The one that we're writing this year does include this area. It doesn't come up until next year. So next January, we'll find out if we have funding for this area again. I'd be more than happy to come out and evaluate defensible space for you. I have a bunch of business cards, hopefully one per group, and I think I brought it.
Another way you can get your property checked is our homeowners insurance. It's USAA. They have a group that came, and they came last year. They were doing walkthroughs. It was a company from Texas that was doing walkthroughs for USAA homeowners insurance. He came, walked through, pointed out things to me, such as I had a rosemary, for a seasoning bush right next to my wooden desk, and he said, if you have a bush that's really pungent, that usually means they have a lot of sap. So I rinsed it out with that, a lot of resin, and I planted another one out in my garden away from the house. But they were very good at telling us, just pointing out, you need to change this, you need to change this.
If you live in this area, I'd be more than happy to come out and just do it personally. But
homeowners insurance.
Homeowners insurance is another thing. If you guys, so FireWise communities, the thing about that, there is some talk about FireWise communities and residents who have defensible space possibly getting an insurance reduction on their premiums. That's something you guys would have to kind of suss out, but it's been done in the past, all right? That's one. And then FireWise communities typically get prioritized in the area first. So in this grant block that I have, we have 2 FireWise communities. So when the funding comes around again, we're going to prioritize those communities. If they've been doing the work themselves, if they still need help doing something, we're going to prioritize that over helping someone that hasn't been doing any work themselves. That makes sense.
So FireWise communities, do we have to break into smaller groups, or can we be this?
It has to make sense. If your goal is to get everyone in the Spencer View Neighborhood Association involved, then this would be great. I mean, we have enough people here. I think we could do that. And you guys might be able to address, as a larger group, typically you guys are going to be heard a little bit better when you go to the city about issues or something like that. So I would say you could do it with this. It just depends.
We have a board that's starting, Shane and I are on now, and so whether there needs to be more members or more boards has to be decided. But we have started that. I want to ask you, neighborhood watch needs to get involved with the neighbors that need help if we have to say in the line. Another question I really want to get to is, have these neighborhoods started having their own patrols around the clock? Patrols looking for, you talk about a fire that couldn't have been spotted for 12 hours or something. I mean, if we can have patrols in our own neighborhood, our own neighbors.
The more eyes out there, the better. I mean, typically that's how we get alerted that there's a fire in the area, is someone falls into smoke. It's all about how active you guys want to be.
How well are we looked at by fire towers or whatever?
If you guys are a proactive community that's working on reducing your fire risk, and I can't speak for the structure folks, so I'll have you answer on others if you're fine. But from our end, if we know that you guys are a FireWise community and you have people in your community and yourselves that are really working to mitigate your risk, you can't really be viewed more favorably from a firefighting perspective. I mean, we can't do it all, and when we come into a community that's got all the work to create a defensible space, it makes our job a lot easier, and we sure do appreciate it.
Yeah, Eugene Fire does the fire protection in this area. Lane Fire, they'll probably end up being brought in to do structural triage and structure protection while the EF actually fights the fire. That's what the management plan says. So if you've got the ability for us to come in and feel like we can leave, that's the most important thing. The first thing we're going to look at is when we drive in is, can we get back out? That's the most important thing for us, is egress. The second thing we're going to look at is if you've got a shake roof, or if you have firewood piled up against your house, or you have things that are obvious triage no-nos, we're going to write the house off, and we're basically saying we can't protect your house. But above all, make sure that if you hear evacuation orders, and I can't stress this enough, please evacuate, because 86 people being lost in the campfire is a horrible, horrible thing.
Mike, do you guys have eyes on us, or are the only eyes we have is us looking out our kitchen window?
In the event of a fire like Paradise, they couldn't get eyes to the places that they needed to quick enough before it was already on the next spot.
And a question about evacuation. Doesn't KLCC, I remember like when some of the Mackenzie River fires, they would be saying on air, you know, that area is in a stage 1 or get ready. I mean, do you guys communicate with the radio station in the area?
Typically, yeah. So on that side, it was Eastern Link, but yeah, they're putting that public information release out there.
Right. Because if we don't get a text.
Just to answer this guy, final point there about, you know, how do we do that, and all that. The FireWise command, I mean, just, you know, taking it in your own hands is honestly, that's the best approach. So when we start talking about evacuation and all that kind of stuff, and, you know, if you're looking out for the guy next to you and he's looking out for you, that's way better than expecting either one of us to look out.
Yeah, we had 2 fires on William Street last summer. Both of them were, people spotted the smoke and called it in. Both of them were utility costs, but in both cases, it was the neighbors who saw the smoke and called it in. So that's how it happened.
Don't hesitate to call 911.
Don't ever hesitate.
Yeah, and that's the number you call. If you see something, you call 911, don't get us.
2 points that I'd like to make. Most of the people in here are in the Eugene Rural Fire Protection District. I'm a Ron athlete, I'm a member of the Fire District Board. One of the things that Mike has mentioned a couple times now is extremely important, and that is I very seriously doubt that there's anything in your house, including your house, that's worth your life trying to stay around when you should evacuate. And so you just, when the time comes, you need to get out.
It makes it a lot easier if the roads aren't clogged with people trying to get out while we're trying to. Absolutely.
The other thing is you mentioned the triage, and the city of Eugene, who protects our district, in addition to Lane Fire Authority, when they're called, they use a triage list that's put out by the state fire marshal's office. And the last 2 or 3 newsletters, which our district sends out every couple of years, has included that triage list. And so when you get the newsletter, if you look at that, you can see very easily what things you need to take care of, because if you have too many bad marks going through that list, you'll see that the fire apparatus will not come to your house.
I appreciate that, Ron. And I actually have, there's some sheets back there. I may not have brought enough, but there's sheets back there that have, you know, how to create defensible space for extreme fire. Right here, we're high, so if you do everything on that list, you're going to be looking great. And when we come up and assess it, there's a very good chance if everything on that list is on.
Can we also download it? Put it on your website and download it?
Yes, absolutely. Good.
I'll put a link to it on the SBNA site.
In terms of an action plan from here, correct me if I'm wrong, if it sounds like the best thing we can do is if each of the local SBNA groups started a FireWise group.
You mean the neighborhood watch group?
Yeah, some are called neighborhood watch, some are called local neighborhood groups. There's a list like this on the back table. So if you want to become active in a FireWise group and you're not already active in your local group, the map shows what areas are where, and there's descriptions in the book with local maps, and this will tell you contact information for the local leader. And that way you can get started with a FireWise group, and that will help. We can also do the local, we can start pestering people, contacting local officials, county officials for developing the community's protection plan. And I will, if Alex has any additional information on that and other things, I will incorporate those into a message and send that out to the whole group. I will also send to the whole group Alex's contact information.
And if we want to have any
information.
questions as well, maybe we can filter those and I can answer kind of further questions that you guys have if you want to write them down.
And my husband Jim has been videotaping this. The plan is that we will post the video of this to the SBNA website.
Use up all of his discs.
I wish I had gone. Tell them to visit that in a little bit.
Oh, no. I'm shooting over the top.
And in terms of coordinating what you are doing, the SBNA board and the SBNA leaders have a meeting this week coming up with the Eugene Fire Chief. And it seems to me that some sort of eventual communication, like a panel discussion or some kind of group discussion of, OTF and fire chief and probably some other resources would help us develop a local plan. So in coordination with the community fire protection plan, we might want to also have a local plan. So anybody who's interested in any of that, send me a message, and I sent you out already. So you've got my email address, and I can get that channeled. And if anybody wants to be heading up any of this, let me know, and I can channel on it.
I have one other
So was that correct? Did you want to add anything to that?
Everything's absolutely great. You have my contact, and one way or the other, I have my contact info here. I'll you stick around. However you want to get.
That is, do you have a CD-ROM or a DVD presentation available, or is it available online? Because I have so much of the neighbor who really needs to see
It might be Jordan. This should be the first one.
When I worked at Washington State University, I did a pre-recorded defensible space. I can send that to Sarah so she can have it as an ad.
OSU extension.
It's a Washington State University extension. I worked there before here, but it's all pretty much the same. They're West.
on the website?
Well, I'll send a link to it to Sarah so that she can get it out to you.
I just have a question with the strategy of managing the debt that was first, especially in this part of the land that's consolidated first or dying.
So her question was, do we have a strategy to deal with dying dead duck birds in the Willamette Valley? In our area. Short answer, we know it's not.
Properties right along the land that because there's been a drought over the last few years, there's lots of depositions that are dying. How to get them all down doesn't really solve the problem because they're on the ground. Is there some strategy or some way of managing it?
So there's no higher level strategy, unfortunately. It mostly comes down to if you cut them down, then you actually have to find a way to remove them from your property, or cut them into firewood, where you can store it away from your house and have it dried and used for another source. Some of the trees are large enough if you catch them early enough. If you work with your neighbors, you may be able to sell some of them to recoup the cost of cutting them down. Unfortunately, there's no larger strategy other than that. If they're individual trees that are fairly spaced from other trees, that's not often the case, but if they happen to be, leaving dead trees here and there is great wildlife habitat. And if a fire were to come through, those dead trees may torch. And then if they're not connected to other live trees, then they spread into the crowns of the other trees. So, unfortunately, I don't have a better answer for you than that. Sorry. But if you work as a community, economies of scale may help with the financial burden of getting rid of some of that. And if you, one of the largest costs is getting that big equipment to your property. And so if you have a few neighbors that are continuous with you, that you want to work together on, then sometimes that can mitigate some of the costs for getting the trees removed.
You have a 13-acre property that has about a third of the trees are dying, and so it's kind of an issue. The other related question would be, if we wanted to replant, what type of tree would be able to replant? Because Douglas fir is just advisory on the permit, the climate is continues.
Right. Okay, so the question was, if you're removing a lot of trees and you want to replant, what should you replant? The first thing I might say is that depending on the number of trees you're removing, you may not need to replant at all. It depends on how dense the trees are originally. Just like in your vegetable garden, when you have too many carrots, they don't grow to be great carrots, they just don't have enough resources. Trees are similar, so they need a proper space to be able to grow big and healthy. So it may just be that the trees that are dying are thinning out the weaker ones and that you won't need to replant in some cases. In some cases, it's large swaths of a whole acre is just gone. And in that case, if you remove those, sometimes you may need to replant. You may be required to, depending on your property taxes. But in that case, I would recommend. It depends on your property tax designation, but I would recommend ponderosa pine. It is a very drought tolerant tree. You'll want the Willamette Valley. Sorry about my voice. You'll want the Willamette Valley ponderosa pine. If you get a seed source from South Oregon or east of the Cascades, the trees will die after 20 years because they're not used to our wet winters. So you want to be sure to make sure they're from our seed source. And then the white oaks are really great for drought and dealing with our really clay soils and wet winters. So I focus on those two tree species. Incense cedar is another tree species that withstands shallow soils and droughts fairly well. They're not great for your defensible space. Pine, not necessarily either for your defensible space areas because they have a little bit higher concentration of those waxy conditions and resins. But they withstand the drought a little bit better. Incense cedar, though, are at the very north end of their habitat. And so sometimes because of the climate here, incense cedar might have a little bit more trouble. So if it's a shadier condition, then I would suggest incense cedar. But if you have full sun, then I'd go for Oregon white oak and ponderosa pine. That was a really long answer. Sorry.
Right, so for people who have like 20 acres or 13 acres or 42 acres, and they have they need 50% of their trees are dying because that's not unusual at all around here. If you look up or you just go down the road, there's patches of dead trees. But the loggers don't want to come and log 7 acres. But if you have 7 acres and your neighbor has 20 acres and you both have trees to go, a logger will come and he will log because it pays him to bring his equipment if he can log this property and then move next door and log that property and move next door and log that property. So if you get together with your neighbors, you can find a logger who will come, cut and remove the trees. And they're dying, but if you don't wait too long, the wood is still useful for various, sources. But once it starts to rot, then you're not going to get anything.
Right. You want to try and catch the trees within a year, hopefully. Some trees you can stretch to 2 years, then they'll still economically viable. The wood is if you want to try to sell them. And then she's exactly right what I said earlier with the economies of scale. It costs, upwards of $150 for the low boy to put the equipment on, for loggers to bring it out to your property. So that's a fixed cost you have to pay no matter what to get the equipment out there. And then in addition to that, the hourly working and L&I and all that stuff. So if you have more trees that you could sell as a group, then it helps pay for it, and you may even make some money from the process as opposed to paying out. So the economy of scale is definitely important if you have a small patch of trees. And you'll want those to be continuous properties. If the machinery has to go back on the lowboy, it's not worth it to them. And working with a consulting forester a lot of times can help, as a group, can help you do that. They can set a lot of that up for you. Make sure you have the right contracts and get people working together. So, I
Yeah, I have a question about long-term ecological studies that have shown, some botanical studies have shown that this area is naturally an oak savanna area, not the Douglas fir area. The Douglas firs have come up in the last 100 years or so, and they're not native to this area. And I'm just wondering if because of climate change, that perhaps we're returning to a drier area, which is the oaks can tolerate.
So
Why would you want to plant more Douglas firs?
So I would mostly agree with you, I'm just going to rephrase that slightly. I would say the Douglas fir are native to this area here. Historically, it was much more dominated by Oregon white oak, woodland, and savanna, and we're talking less than 44 trees per acre of oaks. And that would be intermingled with this Willamette Valley ponderosa pine stands, as well as intermittently sparse Douglas fir and incense cedar. So they are native here, they're just not typically, they weren't typically the dominant tree species. And a lot of that had to do with not only our soil being extremely heavy in clay, but also Native American burning. So when Native Americans managed this land, they did a lot of burning that would cause stand replacement burning, similar to what we talked about in the stand replacement for the Coast Range for Douglas fir forests. And that, when Douglas fir trees are young, they're not very fire resistant. And so that burning would kill a lot of the Douglas fir seedlings, whereas the oaks would resprout quickly. The ponderosa pine are a little bit more fire resistant, they have a thicker bark. And then the Douglas fir that were able to grow larger and get that thick bark were able to stick around, they usually grew with a lot of space around them. And so the beginning of the 1900s, when we were really starting that fire suppression getting heavy, at the same time our climate was going into a cooling period, and so there was a lot more moisture and cooler temperatures, where in addition to us not using fire as a management tool on the landscape, the conditions were right for Douglas fir to be able to thrive. So yes, those started to come in and do what we call encroach on the oak habitats that were typical when Native Americans were burning more frequently. And so over the last 100 years, the Douglas fir has started to come in. That, in addition to people wanting to plant them for, some people like the way they look and want to have them there, and then some people were planting them for economic reasons for farming. And so now, as we're pulling out of this, as climate is changing again and it's getting drier and warmer now, Douglas fir are they're only moderately drought tolerant as compared to some of the other native tree species here. And so they're having a much more difficult time responding to this dryness, and that in addition to the clays really drying out and cracking and harming their roots to where they're not able to absorb the moisture that's coming in the winter, they're experiencing that drought much more heavily. And so I think it's a combination of all those things.